very verbally descriptive, yeah. Okay, well, you probably knew this part by now. My name is Matt Dingler, and this is
Seth, French. Good to be here.
Yeah, and a little bit about myself. My educational background as far as like professional life, social studies and English teacher at the high school level before coming here, where I'm working on obviously a doctorate, but what I focus on specifically is the social studies education.
And I am have kind of a secondary English background. My master's is also in teaching ESL. So I've got some of, I guess, two different English worlds. But yeah, I am happy to be here, happy to talk to you guys about information processing theory. You may wonder why this assortment of pictures is up on this title slide, but I promise you it will make sense at some point. So
Yeah.
now you can start.
Yeah, can I get the water?
Yep.
Thanks. And one thing that we wanted to be sure to include on this, having just looked at the chart, is that, you know, we won't say this word continually tonight, these three long words. We'll probably just say IPT, but that it falls under the cognitivist perspective. And then I think that a few of the following weeks we're still going to be under that. So we kind of said the cognitivist series. This will be the first installment of that. So, oh my goodness.
Oh my goodness.
We just looked at this. We thought this would be a good way to start things.
Oh, that's
Obviously,
funny.
Tom did also, which makes us think we're in the right place. But to draw a few more things out of it, to add to our discussion and maybe even reinforce some of the ideas that we've entertained so far, Overskeed last week pointed out that a lot of times, from the behaviorist perspective, we're asking, or originally the question was asked, why do we do things? And, you know, of course, the reason, theoretically, that this arrived at was, well, because of stimulus and response dynamic. That there are stimuli within the environments. Of course, as educators, we can orchestrate and arrange an environment to eventually elicit certain responses. And over time, these become patterns of behavior, and that's what we understand as learning. So learning occurs in that formula, very simply put. Of course, we know there's a lot more words and a lot more theorists than what's just there. But then, last week with Gestalt, is that how we said it? Close enough? Yeah. Gestalt. Get the T right, it's ST. That there was something also going on to be observed. You know, we're observing stimulus, we're observing behavior, but there's this idea where perception and the mind begins to enter into the equation. If we do, in fact, perceive things differently, we looked at the Gestalt images, seeing them two different ways, that varied from person to person. And so there's something going on that we would say, there's got to be some type of individual difference amongst all of us, suggesting the presence of a mind that's unique to person, and leading us in to think about cognition. And so this week we're talking more about how is it that the processing involved in learning goes on. And so that would be the difference between the two words and the two approaches from the way that we are going about it this evening. So how does learning occur within this thing? Okay. This person, oh, before you even look at that, don't even look at those words yet. You're about to see somebody. And you just saw him, scholarly guy. I believe his name is George Miller. And in looking at other literature outside of, you know, the assigned readings, I saw an interesting one, and he was a cognitivist theorist in the 1950s, 1960s, when what he calls the revolution began, and he kind of writes like I guess it was probably like a 7 or 8 page like reflective. This is what it was like to be there in the moment. And I pulled out a few quotes, and really I would invite you to look at about 4 of the quotes that I pulled from the text and just pick out 1 or 2 words or perhaps a phrase that you think is really indicative of the time period that he existed in and the way that people were experiencing this shift and the way that we think about learning. And maybe we can select a few of those words to hone in on tonight, or maybe you see them and you're like, that's interesting, but I'm going to completely disregard that. So, but take about 30 seconds, gaze at those quotes, select a word or a phrase that you think is interesting. People are starting to mumble. Any words or phrases that stick out?
Counter-revolution.
A counter-revolution. I thought that was interesting. So what do you make of that he calls it a counter-revolution?
Does that mean we're coming back to where we started?
I think like definitely in response to,
Okay.
right? So I don't know if it's a return to something, but I definitely think he sees this as the rise of cognitivism as a response to the rise that preceded it. Yeah.
That phrase made me think of countercultures, which this was the time when they were really emerging, sort of the hippie culture.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought about, and how cognitism perhaps lines up with those same shifts.
And I thought
There's like a whole social, like historical realm we could go into. And I'm
Right,
glad that,
right.
yeah. No, I'm thinking my mind's like shooting off into that world. Thank you. Yeah, Jen.
Because counter-revolution was the first phrase that popped into my head, and I thought of, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed,
Mm-hmm.
and then I thought about our literacy theory class that we took last
Spring.
spring,
Yeah.
and how what I was thinking was that there are theories that emerge from other theories, whether they counter those theories or they just add to it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always moving like that spiral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in terms of like cause and effect, he almost, I think, without intending to do this, admits the importance of behaviorism. Maybe he intends to admit the importance of it, but like indicating that this was a response to this large thing that happened right before it. Mm-hmm.
See, I look at the first one and I see that it's like defining physics as a science of meter reading, which it isn't. I mean, can't really say that's all that is.
Mhm.
So what is he trying to say? That psychology is a study of behavior.
It's bigger than
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those of us who are like more in line with the behaviorist perspective would really take offense to, calling that as the science of meter reading. You're looking at this one little aspect
And that's
of
it.
like what's really going on. Yeah.
I think it's interesting how he says it had become apparent. Well, to
Yeah.
that's what I was at to. Yeah, okay, really?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it
That's kind of
wasn't,
why I like him. Because he just pulls no punches about it.
I was just gonna say, and it's not just like that behaviorism misses the boat a little bit. That third bullet is like behaviorism is an abductor or some sort of like.
It frees itself.
Yeah.
We're liberated.
Yeah.
Again, going to the 60s like cultural
Yeah.
social idea.
But there's the bookend of the experimental psychology.
You're right.
Both of them are, both of them lead to experimental psychology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
Both
that's
behaviorism and
yeah. To me, that to me that last one, almost like I would almost see that opposite, and obviously that's because of where
Sure.
I come from, but
Yeah.
because we're all about like the experimentation,
Yeah.
whereas I don't think of cognitivism as much like that. So.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it goes back to that defining, like, okay, now we've got to define again. We've got to experiment and figure this psychology thing out again. Expand.
Mm-hmm. And on the idea, on the idea of this last bullet, you know, him talking, recognizing the importance of having that experimental element to your psychological study, and then saying, claiming, whether true or not, that like the beauty of like the cognitive revolution was that it brought the mind back into this scientific approach, where perhaps it had been lost. We're going to focus a lot on the mind today as we talk about cognitivism and information processing. So, you all saw this in the text. There's no reason to spend too long on it. But two key assumptions from Bredler. First is that the memory system is active, an organized processor of information. And the fact that it's a system in itself, like that's saying something. That's kind of a newer claim at this point, that there is some type of organizational method to the way that we're taking in information, to the way that we are behaving, learning, that sort of thing, that there's some type of process and that it's an active process. It's not that we are acted upon and then automatically elicit some type of response. And that it is, it is doing something, and perhaps we can trace that. And then also, the prior knowledge plays an important role in learning. We won't say too much about that because I think next week or the week after we have some schema theory people coming up. And then, if we're going to model what this information processing looks like, it follows more or less these steps. Where there used to be a stimulus, now we call that information. This information is encoded so that it can be stored, so that it can be retrieved. But within those last few steps, that encoding is meaning making. That whatever information we're taking in, we're attaching some type of meaning, or perhaps layers of meaning to it to help in our storage, so that kind of helps to know where it goes. What's the Disney movie with the emotions? Inside Out. There's a little bit of this, I don't want to spoil anything, but that's one thing that the emotions are very concerned with. These memories are being made in this child's head, and like kind of the associations with them are changing. And that's like the conflict within the story. Go watch it. But kind of interesting. But then this meaning making, that a lot of this goes into the creation of memory. And this is a big thing that I will concentrate on before we get into things that Seth has in store. So, was there something that I wanted to talk about before? There was some reason that was going to enter into the picture. I'll say that'll be extra credit. We'll come back to that if we need to. Maybe at the end, the discussion questions. Okay, but memory. There we are. Large text, memory. Reason we have that, you have a handout, and what we would invite you to do is to examine that handout closely, but then just flip it over. Also just flip it over to a blank page. Oh my gosh! And if you would, for 5 minutes, if it takes you that long, engage the following activity. We had a title slide. Could you reconstruct that title slide? As well as you can.
Reconstructed, not verbally lit.
Draw it. Draw it. It was in landscape. This paper is in landscape if you turn it to landscape.
There were several images.
There were images. There was text also.
I got time.
You got time?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to take us as long as we might. Because some people are going to be like,
Draw what it looks like. So recall what it looked like and draw. Yeah, that very first slide with the picture. 3 days.
Yeah, so the title slide.
Yeah, the title.
The very first slide, there were some images, there was some
This
text.
should be guest stop, shouldn't it? I know what that was about, the missing parts.
I'm drawing a title.
I don't know, so that something like
It's clearly a
Do you like my Sherlock Holmes?
It looks fantastic.
Versus Sherlock Holmes. What's this one?
Yeah.
Here, sure we have some smoke to it.
Okay, well, all the little messy things were made it hard.
Sorry.
Yeah,
that
the
was
messy things. Not concerned about the messy things.
No, I mean, it was.
Oh, well, then by all means, please put down the messy things.
That's all I got.
Oh, she did?
We're
just observing how everyone did. We were trying to think about who would get what things on there.
Did you guys copy off each other once you saw something that you did?
Was this more of a social?
This isn't a test. You guys are going to be graded on this.
We're just amazing.
That's impressive.
Recalling.
I'm in.
The fact that he questioned is very offensive.
Sorry.
You should really know how to draw Arkansas.
Oh, right.
Okay. Walking around the room, you all have taken different approaches to this and had different results. And before we talk about it all together, because I would like to hear kind of large group what happened, would you just take a moment to discuss with the person next to you how you went about recreating this? Like what was going on in your mind? So like think aloud, like metacognitive. What was going through your head as you created it?
I remember noticing that this, whatever that picture was, I don't remember exactly what it was. I remember noticing that the background did not echo because I was wondering, I was just thinking, I wonder if they could cut around that and put it on there. Because I can't do anything like that, so I bet you could do that. So that's what made that stick in my mind.
I did, like, the words, I remember the word, well, we use words, and it's some of the things I don't know how to do, like, job, right, Sherlock Holmes, I forgot about it.
Oh, that's right. I'm pretty sure I thought there was a I had forgotten about that face, even though I did look at that quite so often.
The background, they wrote that.
White, like you can see that it's a square, a white square with coming in as opposed to just a black thing on the other background. Like the clearness of the background, the rest of it doesn't go into that picture.
Yeah, I feel like more.
Take about 30 seconds.
Like the person in the background,
I thought they
I'll try to draw the mask and the hawk and the soldier.
All right, thank you everyone for engaging in that.
I can't remember which the.
Before we move on, I can't miss this. We can't miss this opportunity to talk about what did you hear from perhaps like the person next to you, or maybe even your own thought process. But what are some things that you all discussed as far as like memory goes and your process going through this?
I remember things that I have personal connections with. So I only remember the images that I personally connect with, like Sherlock Holmes, I'm assuming that's who he is. I know who he is, but it's not a personal connection, so my brain lets that go. That's in the arena of my life, actually. But Arkansas, the state representation, and the Razorback are personal connections, so my brain holds on to that.
I'd just like to take a look real quick. How many people got the state outline? Okay, how many people got the Razorback? Okay, How many people got the, I don't even know what to call this thing in the middle.
The finder.
The finder. How many people got the
Oh, that's what that was.
Finder?
finder?
Why is that a binder?
How many of
It's
those
a little
people are
like-
like?
Oh, I don't have math.
And then how many people got the Sherlock?
I should have. I didn't-
Okay. From what I'm observing, it's kind of interesting, and maybe you saw this as you looked at the hands, but the hog was like the most identified. And then the least was the finder. And I'd like to hear just some more observations about that, Jen.
Well, can I something? So when you said IPT, the
Yes.
first thing came to my mind is this integrated performance assessment that we always use in 490 classrooms.
Uh-huh.
So that's the acronym that I was assimilating to my already existed schema. But then somehow that acronym helped me to remember the new meaning that it takes on. So then that made me think about, oh yeah, that's mnemonics. The strategy that we use to help us remember things. So anyway, so just a lot of things start.
I mean, like, there's so many layers to that. Like, you use an existing, like, mnemonic to create, like, the new thing. That's awesome. That's like a different twist on, like, the memory thing and the schema thing. Yeah, Will.
I had, like, for the Finder Mac, I had like an emotional reaction to that. Because I have a Mac, but I don't even look at that icon. It's because I grew up with the Mac in my room as a kid, the old one, and that face would always, when I turn it on, it would, so it's like this nostalgia that hit me real hard.
Wow.
And so,
You're feeding right into it. Like, where I wanted to go.
You're slammed.
Like, I was looking for, like, tech, like, Apple images, and I was like, but if we choose this one, someone might have some deep, like, childhood connection to it.
Wow.
He's gonna have to see a therapist now.
You know, for me, the deep connection was with those messy background things.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
I didn't like that because when you put it up there, I was like, ooh, this is a really good theme that they chose for this particular thing. But the beaker and the equals MC squared and the brain, those were the things that were in the way. They just kept muddying those waters. And a lot of that was talked about in the chapter, that those things were like, they stood out more than those bigger icons. I'm not from Arkansas. I do not relate to those at all. This is how well I can draw the shape of Arkansas. I don't know what it looks like at all. If you put Idaho up there, I could have drawn it almost perfectly. And I bet you all couldn't.
Nope.
So,
You're right.
those other things were distractions to me, but they were the things calling out to me, were those other messy parts.
And if you all saw her paper, some of these things that are smaller are actually exaggerated.
Yes,
On
they were
hers.
big, and I saw it, and I thought it was not that big.
You were going to make a point. Yeah.
I think we were just, she mentioned it first, and then so it was really her idea to begin with, but when you first put the slide up, just from reading, I knew the chapter was about memory.
Yeah.
And so she said, I bet we're gonna have to.
She said, start memorizing. I didn't hear that. I wish I listened to her.
But, so we did, but I didn't get the middle thing, because to me, I don't know what that is, so I didn't remember it.
Yeah.
It wasn't in my memory, so I didn't remember it, but, and then,
we could convince each other, which was pretty awesome. I liked that we could influence each. So if you witnessed a crime, we would have the same burglary. Like, that's kind of scary to think about.
but you had a good deal of the idea about this.
We knew the information processing theory with the title and all of that from prior knowledge. So even if you left off all the images, I could infer, because it's a title slide, that you were going to have that information.
So we had the title because we knew from.
Yeah. Two more.
I'd like to go back to Gestalt and say that I think many of us may have not even thought about the Finder image because it's so similar in color to those background images too. And so it just kind of blended in with all of this.
And that's kind of what we said about the Razorback, because it stood out. So
Yeah,
it's the
it
first thing you
definitely
see is the Razorback, just because of the color.
And also mnemonically, I assumed we were doing something detective-like, so that's, but I made it a silhouette and not Sherlock Holmes. I knew there was a silhouette there, but I didn't, and so that you can play into that short term. in a minute if you want to.
Sure. But yeah, I love that you bring the perception idea back into it. Spencer, last?
Yeah, no, when Lennon was talking, it just made me think about, like, the only reason I remembered anything is because Seth said at some point this is going to become relevant, so at that point I knew I need to start memorizing this. So it made me think about the difference between when you're told to memorize something versus when you're just looking at it and you're just observing it, and then you have to try to remember it. And then when Lennon mentioned, like, witnessing a crime, like, that happens. And so if you were told you're about to see a burglary, remember everything that happens, you're going to be so much better at it than if you just happen to see, an assault on the street.
So if this wouldn't have been a whole chapter over memory, we would
I would
have
have failed.
Yeah.
I know that was the last comment, but London,
But I can teach you.
sorry, Spencer's comment made me think about comprehension and fluency research, literacy research. So kids get tested for fluency, which is how many words per minute they can read all the time. But if you simply cue them beforehand, I'm going to ask you a question about this afterwards, they remember it, and if you don't cue it, they don't. And I just think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, there's and that gets into the discussion question we have at the end, just about, when it comes to our practice in memory. Yeah, and so you guys, you definitely, as we discussed this, you talked about your process that you went through. You're getting this idea that in cognitivism, learning is associated with memory. But there are a lot of tricky dimensions to that. But in terms of how do we further develop, how do we enhance our learning, that sort of thing, you guys are getting the idea that things are encoded for use later on when there are meanings attached to them. And so that's something that we're going to concentrate on as we look at instructional implications of this. So there is one study that we don't need to replicate because we just did like a study type thing, but then I encountered in the literature that was recent, and it was related to this, kind of maybe where I got the idea, I don't know, but essentially they asked this research question. How well can people remember the Apple logo? So that was what they asked. It was undergraduates in a psych class at UCLA. And there we have it up in the top right. I'm not blocking it. Of course, you can see it on everybody's screens around here. But using a 14-point drawing scale, participants were scored. And these are the types of things that they recreated. So they run the whole range, right? They go from the heart or the stomach, in the bottom right there, some type of internal organ, to the things that scored a 14, like the one in the middle, that got a score of a 14, and I can see why. And that's really interesting because they also asked them about their confidence. I'm not going to really talk about that, but as you can imagine, some of them were very overconfident, but then their drawings did not match. The correlation that they ran was completely no, these things don't correlate. But then those who were Apple only, this is how they broke down the groups. So those who were Apple users only, they scored a mean average of 8.27. PC only, as you might expect, 7.2, they have less and less exposure to the Apple every day. And then they did mixed, which actually got the lowest, but none of these were statistically significant, which led these researchers to make the following conclusion, boiled down. People think they can remember these things well, but they really cannot do that. And one of their explanations, the reason that there wasn't a statistical significance, was that they experienced attentional saturation, meaning that, to some point, the meaning that we attach to things really does help us remember, unless, for them, there was this term, attentional saturation, that begins to actually work against you. Because you see something so often, it loses so much of its meaning.